finishing loudly. So I got a question about, Meg.
I have another question.
Okay. I got a question about this precipitous drop of some hormones, especially estrogen, that has effects other than just maintaining the uterine endometrium, and you'll see development of the breast. This is a precipitous decline. It can have major effects on the body. It can have a very major effect on the brain and cause postpartum depression. Major depression of a woman after delivery of a baby, it can be debilitating. You know, imagine the woman is saying, "This should be the happiest day of my life." Well, maybe or maybe not, but you know, this should be a happy day, and yet I can't get out of bed. And that's not necessary. It's not always purely psychological. It can have a physiological basis. Estrogen has effects on the brain. And a dramatic drop in estrogen can have dramatic effects on the brain. And that can be one of the triggers for postpartum depression, along with other things. Meg?
I know that the embryonic adaptation is necessary. Why would you make it so it needs to be high during pregnancy? So why is there mechanisms for excretion in the urine?
Why do we have sustained HCG?
Yeah, but then you said that because like pregnancy tests, there's like small bits in the urine. So why is it excreted if we need it?
Oh, it's excreted because small proteins below a certain size in the blood can get into urine, right? Remember the filtration process. So we're not trying to excrete it. It's just that it's small enough to be excreted. Does that answer your question? Another question, yes?
Yeah, sorry, this is like super out of left field. I just had the thought, what would happen if that hormone, the one in green that has a long name,
Chorionic gonadotropin. It's fun to say. Chorionic gonadotropin.
What would happen if, like, I don't know, a shot of that was put into an organism with XY chromosomes? Like, because, I mean, there's not any, the structure, the corpus luteum. We don't have a corpus luteum in this thing.
Yeah, so when women are so let's talk about in vitro fertilization, right? In vitro, which I know almost nothing about, so I'm trying to put this together. And so I'm on really thin ice. So don't take this anywhere outside of this room, because I could be wrong on just about everything I'm about to say. But to do in vitro fertilization, you need to, a woman needs to ovulate a bunch of oocytes. And they do that hormonally. They inject hormones to allow multiple oocytes to become dominant, to get ready for ovulation. So all kinds of chemicals are used to allow multiple oocytes to become dominant, so that there's multiple mature follicles, and then they use LH and FSH to induce multiple ovulations, and then they collect those oocytes before they get ejected from the uterine endometrium. So they use hormones to induce multiple ovulations. Then those oocytes are mixed with sperm in the dish. That's in vitro fertilization. And then they have to do. I don't know at what stage they allow those embryos to develop. I don't know if they stop them here. My guess is they stop them here, somewhere before they get to the blastocyst stage. This I'm not sure. pretty sure they stop cell, mitosis, and they stop cytokinesis and cell division at this stage. The embryo is frozen. But then in order for it to continue, to actually get a baby out of an in vitro fertilization, it has to be implanted into a uterus, whether it's the maternal uterus or a donor uterus. And in that case, they probably have to prime that uterus with chorionic gonadotropin in order to make the uterine endometrium support the implanted embryo and to cause the woman's corpus luteum to produce estrogen and progesterone necessary for a successful pregnancy. My understanding is that in vitro fertilization is pretty unpleasant for the donor woman. It just doesn't feel good. And of course the acceptor woman, whether it's the actual donor of the oocytes or not, is now going to get pregnant, which an artificially induced pregnancy by implanting an embryo and then sort of artificially triggering the beginning hormonal changes of a pregnancy, I think that can be kind of unpleasant too. Not sure. Okay, pregnancy. Now we have a fetus, not an embryo, a fetus. All kinds of changes, right? Fetus presses against the lungs, changing respiration. Fetus is pressing against circulation, including the inferior vena cava, all kinds of issues related to circulation. So multiple changes in human physiology as a result of this large baby in a belly of a woman. But let's focus on delivery. So there's stretch of the uterine endometrium and now myometrium, stretch of the muscle layer. So this muscle layer that used to be about this big, maybe even this big, is now this big, right? It's developed and is now undergoing stretch. The cervix is undergoing stretch. I guess stretch activated ion channels. That stretch is detected. So we have stretch that is detected. It's detected, so I am not sure what is released from the cervix when it is stretched. So I'm not sure of what causes this pathway, but something about stretch, whether it is neuronal or endocrine, or both, right? After all, we have nerve cells connecting the brain to the cervix, right? So there could be a neuronal connection or an endocrine connection, but in any case, cervical stretch is detected by the hypothalamus, by the brain. The hypothalamus releases oxytocin at the posterior pituitary. Remember, the posterior pituitary is just a sort of a pouch, an extension of the hypothalamus. The posterior pituitary does not rely on portal circulation. It's really where the terminals of hypothalamic neurosecretory cells, those that secrete oxytocin. Those hypothalamic neurosecretory cells release their oxytocin into the blood at the posterior pituitary. But this is really, the posterior pituitary is really a part of the brain. Oxytocin is triggers the contraction of the uterine smooth muscle. And that causes more cervical stretch because it's pushing the baby downward. Contraction of the uterine muscle, further stretch of the cervix. The uterus releases paracrine. This is really a paracrine stimulus. The stretch and the contractions of the uterus. So the uterine smooth muscle are all connected to each other. So if one contracts and releases some prostaglandin nearby, it'll trigger the contraction of its nearby neighbors. So there's both electrical and chemical coupling of all of these millions of cells, millions of smooth muscle cells. And so you get waves of contraction during labor and delivery. You can get small, this can happen prematurely, and they try to quiet things down. But at term, this positive feedback loop, and this positive feedback loop, and this positive feedback loop are all associated with waves of uterine contraction. That's labor. Some of you may have heard of a drug called Pitocin. Pitocin is a drug, it's basically oxytocin. Pitocin is oxytocin that is used to induce labor. So sometimes if a woman is now 42, 43 weeks pregnant and they're worried that the baby's getting too big to be delivered, they will induce labor by an intravenous dose, infusion of oxytocin to try to induce the labor in order to get this positive feedback system going on its own. So this is the drug that induces labor. Labor, delivery. I'm not going to go into this for the issue of time, but the strong uterine contractions, the painfully strong uterine contractions are what pushes the baby out the vagina, and we now have birth. Yes, Olivia.
Do you know what the reason is for why some pregnancies last like longer than 40 weeks? Or like what makes them go longer?
I don't know the answer to that. I could ask my daughter-in-law, who's a nurse midwife. She might have an answer to that question. I don't know. The question was, why do some pregnancies end at 38 weeks? I mean, some perfectly typical pregnancies can be 38 weeks or 39 or 40. And why do they start to go long? Why does this positive feedback loop not get going on its own in some cases? And I don't know the answer. Yeah.
This oxytocin is there, do they give doses if a woman's been in labor for a
No,
month?
no. If a woman is in good labor, I mean, strong contractions, cervical dilation happening, they just let it go. They don't, my understanding is they don't try to boost this with Pitocin during labor. But I could be wrong, because there are cases of pregnancy where there's labor, there's contractions, it's painful, the cervix dilates to a certain point, but then stops dilating, just doesn't dilate enough. I think what they do in that case is a cesarean section. I don't know if they intervene like this to try to boost the strength of the contractions or to increase the dilation of the cervix. Yeah.
Now you said when these contractions occur early, the body tries to downregulate it or quiet it down. Is there like a specific hormone that is used as an inhibitory pathway, or does it just try and reduce the levels of oxytocin?
I don't know if they have drugs. I don't know if they have I think they can use antiprostaglandins. I mean, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs like ibuprofen can inhibit the production of prostaglandins. That's how they work, and maybe they can use those to try to reduce this part of the positive feedback. I don't know if they have drugs that are sort of oxytocin receptor blockers that could try to block this. What I do know is that they sometimes if there's premature labor, they often, try to use position, tell the woman, lie down. Just don't, stop moving around. Stop using gravity to put stretch on the cervix. Yeah.
I was just thinking about pain and delivery and how an epidural is used. And since I'm pretty sure they usually use fentanyl, and that's like a really strong opioid. Why with pain modulation is that injected into the spine rather than other areas of the body? what's special about the spine in terms of pain modulation with like opioid receptors?
Let's see, I thought I had a slide that would help me illustrate this. So my understanding of an epidural is not that it is opioid receptors, but that it is voltage-gated sodium channels that they are trying to block. They are using a local anesthetic, a fast-acting, long-acting local anesthetic that they are injecting into the, so the epidural is injected, say, here. And so they are blocking all, and they try to inject the local anesthetic, the sodium channel blocker, into the pain pathway, right, into the anterolateral column, but I don't think they have that much, and they don't actually inject it into the spine. Epidural means they're injecting it into the space around the spinal cord. And so the drug, penetrates, blocks the voltage-gated sodium channels, but the goal is to block the voltage-gated sodium channels that are carrying pain information from the lower body. But it could, so from all areas below the level of the blockade. So it would block pain from the legs. It would basically block pain from everything below, including the uterus. And so the uterus is still working fine, it's still contracting, labor is continuing, but there's no longer a sensation reaching the brain. And so because of blocking action potentials in the pain pathway is preventing the information from getting to the brain. Now it could also be blocking motor pathways, so in principle you could say, well, does the woman become paralyzed? Do her legs become paralyzed during an epidural? I don't know. Because that blocking the motor pathway would block movement of the legs. I could ask my nurse midwife daughter-in-law whether there is weakness or paralysis of the legs during an epidural. I'm sure she's delivered hundreds of babies now, and so I'm sure she has been in a delivery room with a mom who's on an epidural. There's no way she hasn't been. Yeah.
Is there a difference in hormones in like Braxton Hicks contractions versus like real?
Oh, you're way outside of my level of expertise now. So I can give you my daughter-in-law's email address and you can ask her questions. There's a certain level of danger of me speculating that I won't go to. And you just reached it. Braxton Hicks contractions are early contractions, right? And so I think they are, but I am not sure that those contractions are related to this story. I'm not sure at all. So I'm going to shut up now and do what I said I was going to do and not speculate. Delivery of the baby, delivery of the placenta. Let's just move on to lactation. So during, from puberty on, there has been cycles of estrogen and progesterone in the female. And so, you all know, one of the signs of puberty is development of the breast. Estrogen is primarily responsible for the development of the breast during menstrual cycles, and then accelerated or increased by this long, 9-month sustained estrogen. Right, so there were small spikes of estrogen, or small pulses of estrogen every month for years, let's say, that led to the development of the breast. But then it stops. Obviously, women's breasts don't grow every month, forever. They grow and then there's a stasis. But during pregnancy, there is continued development of the breast, and this, most importantly, the progesterone that is also high and sustained during pregnancy develops the secretory alveoli of the mammary gland. Right? The mammary gland is a gland. It secretes a product. The product in this case is milk. So estrogen supports the development of the breast. Progesterone supports development of these secretory alveoli. Those of you who've taken A&P2 know why we're using the word alveoli. This looks like the air sacs in the lung, which are called alveoli. But these are not filled with air. These are filled with fluid, milk. Progesterone supports the development of the structure, the secretory alveoli. Prolactin, we're finally getting to prolactin from the anterior pituitary. Prolactin stimulates those now well-developed secretory alveoli to make milk. So estrogen stimulates the development of the breast. Progesterone stimulates the development of the secretory mechanism. Prolactin stimulates the activation of that stimulatory mechanism to make milk. And then oxytocin is going to be important for the ejection of milk during breastfeeding. Remember that prolactin was kept under negative control by dopamine throughout until now. For years and years and years, those developed breasts were not secreting milk because there was no prolactin, because the anterior pituitary lactotropes were being inhibited by dopamine. Oops, sorry. But at birth and during breastfeeding, suckling, that stimulus to the brain tells the hypothalamus to stop secreting dopamine. Right? There's a stimulus that the birth and the mechanical stimulation of the nipple both tell, the brain senses it, of course, it's very sensitive. The brain senses that the hypothalamus stops secreting dopamine at the median eminence. Let no dopamine getting to the lactotropes. No more inhibition. The lactotropes secrete prolactin. I crossed out this thing about prolactin releasing factor. Let's just leave that aside. So prolactin released into the bloodstream, all goes everywhere, but it binds to prolactin receptors on the secretory alveoli and activates their mechanisms for the production of milk. Milk is a mixture of protein, fat, water, sugars, immunoglobulin. It's a complicated secretory mix, but it's stimulated by prolactin. The mechanical stimulation of the nipple during breastfeeding is also detected by the brain, also stimulates hypothalamic neurons that have their nerve terminals in the posterior pituitary to release oxytocin. So remember, oxytocin was important for initiating contractions in labor, but it's also important for initiating contractions of myoepithelial cells. They aren't exactly muscle, but they do have contractile machinery. So that's why they're myoepithelial. Those myoepithelial cells, contraction causes milk ejection. And sometimes, so the baby is not only sucking the milk from the nipple, but is mechanically stimulating the nipple to get the milk being squirted into its mouth. Pregnant women sometimes will start lactating just by seeing another baby, or by seeing another baby breastfeed, or just spontaneously. Women who are breastfeeding often will spontaneously start to lactate just because it's the brain after all. If they start thinking about their baby, they start thinking about breastfeeding, and they start thinking, I mean, the brain does what it does, and the hypothalamus stimulates production and secretion of milk. Oh, one last thing. Prolactin does a negative feedback on the hypothalamus and tells the gonadotropin releasing hormone, the GnRH releasing cells of the hypothalamus, shut up, don't do anything. And so those cells that typically were important for releasing release of LH, or the release of the GnRH that stimulated the release of LH and FSH, are now kept under tight negative control. And that's why breastfeeding is good birth control, because we're not going to get a spike of LH and FSH. There's going to be no more ovulations under, typical breastfeeding conditions. So as long as a woman is breastfeeding, they are pretty infertile because ovulation is inhibited. Now, it's not the best birth control because, ovulation can happen. Some babies some pregnancies happen even while a woman is breastfeeding, that everybody gets surprised, but it happens. I think we're pretty close to done. Question?
This is about the sperm from the beginning of the presentation. Is there anything that makes them more favorable? Because you said that they get destabilized, they have to get destabilized just enough. Is there anything that makes them more favorable to get destabilized just enough, or is it just kind of random if they do?
All right. So the question is, the Goldilocks. You're saying how do we get that Goldilocks level of sperm destabilization in the vagina in order for them to survive the trip, but also be able to fertilize the oocyte. I don't know of any, so for example, a couple that's infertile because the man, not because the woman isn't ovulating and not because the man's not producing enough sperm, but the sperm just are not robust enough to get all the way to where they need to get to. I don't know if that happens. And I don't know if, so again, I'm at a dangerous level of knowledge. I don't know whether there are interventions that can increase or decrease the ability of the sperm to survive. Now, I do know that drug companies are working on male birth control, and you could imagine that that could be a target for male birth control. If we could find a way we don't want to kill the sperm, but we want to make it so that they're never going to make it through the cervix. That could be a way to do that, to make them so, flimsy that they will never get through the vagina and the cervix. I don't know if that's a target or not. Again, my level of information is on thin ice. I'm at a risky level of knowledge here. Maybe?
Why does it seem so difficult for fertilization to occur? Is there anything like evolutionarily people have reproduction here?
Yeah. Well, it's not. I guess I gave you the impression that this is something that is very difficult. But, if a woman is fertile, let's talk about the maximum fertility of a woman is probably at, around 16 years old, something around there, maybe 18. If a woman is fertile and undergoing, has sex, there's a pretty decent chance of fertilization and pregnancy happening. So it's not like, it is difficult, but but it can happen every time. I mean, in the olden days, women would have 10, 12 babies. It can't have been difficult if they're having 10 or 12 babies over the course of however many years. So I gave you the impression that it looked like it would never happen, because obviously it happens regularly. But it's not just, I wanted to leave you with the idea that it's not just one sperm that does the whole thing. It requires multiple steps, which require multiple sperms. Question or no?
Well, I don't know. This is probably gonna sound ridiculous, but when you described how multiple sperm are like necessary, even though only one sperm fertilizes the egg, I was thinking like Space Invaders. We have like those little houses, and like each kind of alien can shoot like once, and then it hits the house, and it's like short a little bit. And I think that's like sperm, where it's like destroying the houses each one. So you need like multiple to like win the game or like get through to the zona. Pellucida, thank you. But then that one is the one that makes you lose in Space Invaders or be fertilized.
Okay, so those of you who played Space Invaders, maybe this is a good analogy. It doesn't work for me, because I've never touched that. All right, well, it's been a pleasure teaching you. But you're not, I'm done, but you're not done yet. Well, I'm not done. I have to give you an exam and grade the exam. So, and I have to pin the cadaver. So remember, you've got a quiz on Thursday or Friday, and you've got an exam on Tuesday. I am happy to answer questions as you prepare for the exam. You know, a lot of material, relatively short period of time. If you want guidance on how would I study for the exam, I can give you some insight because I sort of know what the exam would look like. I'm not going to give you questions, I'm not going to give you answers, but I'm happy to give you guidance on effective study strategies.
Are we
Andrew?
going to do exam review in this class?
I have no plans for a formal exam review. If you ask for it and we can schedule it, I'm happy to do it with groups. But I'm not going to schedule, I haven't scheduled an exam review. But I'm available on Monday, for example. Well, wait a second. No, it's complicated. Monday, I'm selling my house, so there's things going on. So I don't want to say that I'm available, but I would try. The weekend, the weekend's available too, but things are going on, including closing on a deal that I need to do on Monday. Meg?
I just have a question, because throughout like quizzes and exams we've had review on anatomy and now we're having the lab practical. Is the anatomy, I don't know if you can this question, but is anatomy on the final exam going to be more focused on this last unit or are
Yes.
you going to, okay.
So I'll be honest with you. I figure between the anatomy quizzes and the practical quiz, I'm quizzing you pretty intently on muscle nerve anatomy. So that will not be on the final exam. So the anatomy part of the final exam is endocrine. And in fact, it's not very major. Most of and let's call it exam 3, because it's really mostly an exam on the endocrine section with a little bit of cumulative final thrown in. And it's mostly physiology. So focus on the anatomy for the practical, because that's real, that has value. But, I mean, obviously it's a quiz, it's got 50 points. But focus on physiology for the final exam. Yes?
Does the lab practical include brain anatomy, or is it just muscle?
Brain will be included in the lab practical.
Okay, thank you.
Michael?
Will the cadaver be open today?
I cannot make the cadaver just open, but I have scheduled certain cadaver reviews for students who have asked for access to the cadaver. So for example, right now the lab is open, so you can get to AMP Revealed pretty much any time. So AMP Revealed is just open. I will make an effort to make sure the lab is open so that you can get to and I'll make sure the AMP, at least 2 of the AMP computers, the anatomy, the AMP Revealed computers are running the program. So that's accessible pretty much any time you can get into the building. But I can't do that with the cadaver. So I do know that today at 1 o'clock, the cadaver will be available. And I know that tomorrow, 10 o'clock? Tomorrow at 10 o'clock, the cadaver will be available. Those are the 2 times I have scheduled. If you want to try to schedule something outside of that, we need to work it out.
Sure.
I'm happy to do it, as long as, but I need to be nearby when students are working with the cadaver. Yeah,
It's kind of random, but, like in AMP2, we talk about, like the stomach acid and use stomach to protect your stomach. And you said the mucus in the cervical canal, in the obstacles to the sperm, does it also have an effect with like, or is there a reason that it would like stop the acidic in general, the vagina from like going into the uterus? Or,
Yeah.
like,
so the mucus plug, which changes properties, goes from a very thick, gooey mucus plug to a thin, more watery, stretchier mucus plug that allows sperm to get through easier. That mucus plug is also protective of the uterus. So it protects the uterus from getting the acidic secretions from the vagina. It protects bacteria or other, external factors or whatever. That probably doesn't happen very often, but external things getting into the uterus. The uterus is a fairly safe space. There are leukocytes in there to try to make sure there's no infection, but the mucus plug is important for protecting the uterine environment from external invaders, including sperm, but allowing sperms, sometimes. Lindsay?
I have a question on fertilization. So it's only one sperm that fertilizes the egg.
That's
So
right.
how does that work in the case of twins?
Twins. So let's talk about dizygotic twins, non-identical twins. Dizygotic twins are twins where 2 oocytes were ovulated, and 2 oocytes go through completely independent fertilizations. So those are non-identical dizygotic twins. Identical twins, monozygotic twins. I'm on thin ice here. I know that it is 1 oocyte gets fertilized, but one of the early stages of meiosis produces 2, not 1, separate zygotes. So there's a mistake, a difference in early mitosis that generates, not a mistake, it's just not typical. And it generates 2 zygotes from 1 fertilized oocyte. It's not 2 sperms, that's not the same as polyspermy. It's 1 sperm, 1 oocyte, and then a unusual event in mitosis that generates 2 separate, identical embryos that each then develop their own placenta, their own, become a fetus and a placenta, and two pretty much separate pregnancies within the same uterus. Jenna. And then
What causes twins to be like a genetic thing then? Like it runs in more families than
Yeah. So ask ask Emmett. Emmett is the person in the biology department who would know why. So it's true that twins tends to run in families. Now what I don't know is whether is it monozygotic or dizygotic twins that tends to run in families. So that's a question. But it's true that it runs in families, and ask Emmett about the genetics of twinning as far as family history. Olivia?
Unless I misunderstood, how could 2 eggs be like ovulated at once if you have like the 3 polar bodies to 1 mature ovum? Would that mean like just double that number, or like how does that work?
Well, remember, we've got two ovaries, so there is sort of an alternating, one ovary sort of works more one cycle, and then the other ovary works more the other cycle, and I don't know what causes that alternation. But it's not perfect, so in some cases, so the follicles could develop in two separate ovaries, completely independent of each other. All of that step that I showed happening in one ovary could in principle happen in two ovaries, and then there's two ovulations triggered by the LH, FSH surge, and then two oocytes going into the two fallopian tubes and both getting fertilized in the two fallopian tubes. So that's one way you could get dizygotic twins, just the two different two different oocytes, development of two different follicles, ovulation of two different oocytes, fertilization of two different oocytes from the two different ovaries. I suppose it's also possible that one ovary could develop two mature follicles. So there's sort of this race where one follicle typically becomes dominant. But if two are so, neck and neck, that neither of them kills off the other, causes the other to undergo atresia, then in one ovary, it's possible for two follicles to become dominant, for two follicles to undergo full development, and for two ovulation events to happen from one ovary more or less at the same time. So I think both of those happen for the development of dizygotic twins. Yeah, Hannah.
Hey, Bob.
Okay, just a second. Hannah?
I know we kind of touched on the placenta, but what is its whole function besides being a median between the baby and the mother?
That's pretty much the major function, is to provide blood contact between fetal blood and maternal blood, so that maternal oxygen, right, but only the mother is breathing, so maternal oxygen can be delivered to the fetal circulation. And fetal CO2 can be delivered to the maternal blood so that it can be exhaled from maternal respiration. So the placenta is also, well, I'm sure there are other functions of the placenta, but that's the main function, to provide nutrient and waste product exchange between the two bloodstreams. Zoe, did you have a question?
Yeah, is it possible for the zygote to implant somewhere that's not in the uterus?
Of course it is, yeah. So if a fertilized oocyte doesn't travel, it can implant in the fallopian tubes, and that's an ectopic pregnancy, and can be dangerous. Obviously, this tissue is not prepared to develop like this tissue is. And that can cause, there can be rupturing of the fallopian tube, and so it's dangerous both to the fetus and to the mother. It can be fatal to both the fetus and the mother. Ectopic pregnancies. Now, another question, so is it possible for an oocyte to get all the way down here and implant in the vagina, or somehow escape from the fallopian tube and implant on the outside of the uterus? One thing is, I never say never, but I think that is extremely rare. Ectopic pregnancies are not extremely rare. Let's see, okay, Logan.
How would you suggest that we go about studying for the final?
So I have two strategies that I recommend. One is to go back through your section exams. And don't just learn from the questions. Ask yourself, what concept was this question getting at? And then make sure you understand that concept. And then ask yourself, well, wait a second, he asked me this concept, and he asked me this concept. But I was really surprised that he did. I studied this other thing, and it wasn't on the exam. And I was pissed because I studied this other thing and it wasn't on the exam, and I couldn't get the points that I expected. Well, try to remember being angry that something wasn't on the exam, because there's a chance that's something that was important and, but just somehow got cut out of the section exam will be on the final exam. So use the section exams for guidance of what could be retested on the final exam. Use the section exams for guidance on what will be in the endocrine section, which you haven't had yet, right? But the point is, oh, I see, when he was asking me about the nervous system, he asked me this kind of question. Well, maybe I'm going to map that kind of question onto the endocrine section. But remember, the final exam, the cumulative part of the final exam, is relatively small compared to the endocrine part of the final exam. So, you probably want to allocate your resources for studying similarly. Focus your efforts on the endocrine section, and then go back and map your knowledge, or, think about what kind of questions Bob likes to ask on the section exam, what kind of question could he ask me on the endocrine exam, and see if you can answer. If you want to ask me a question, will you ask me to name the hormone that is responsible for the secretion of prolactin? I think the answer is yes. I could expect you to know that dopamine is the hormone that inhibits the prolactin secretion. That's part of this knowing the story of the anterior pituitary. But you can ask me questions like that. Do you expect me to know let me just find some. Do you expect me to know what a blastocyst is? Oh, I see what you would do. Okay, I get it. Blastocyst. I will not expect you to know blastocyst. Okay, so I get it. Okay. Lindsay.
Okay, so this is actually a question on Monday's lecture that kind of leads into this lecture. When we talked about estrogen and some of its effects is oocyte maturation, how does that, and so obviously that leads to, or into fertilization, is when the oocyte is mature. It's released, I would assume. But how does that work in the case of someone who is estrogen dominant or produces an excess of estrogen?
This is way outside of my area.
Okay, I didn't know. I just figured I'd ask
Yeah,
in case.
I don't know.
You just write your daughter-in-law's email.
I should just, well, I have to ask her permission to do that. She's pretty busy delivering babies, so I don't want to just broadcast for email to everybody, but I will certainly ask her some questions. She's very, she loves hearing her knowledge. Okay?
I know that you said throughout this lecture, the development is not something, is there, we're focusing on or expecting to be?
Development of the baby from a zygote to a fetus is not on the exam.
Okay.
Is it what?
Oh, I haven't another question.
So you know.
Surprise!
What's your favorite band?
My single favorite band?
Yeah.
That is so, not a question. It depends on what mood I'm in.
What were you at, Bob?
Yeah.
Oh,
We can do this for another hour.
my favorite band of all time? Let me just give my favorite song of all time.
Sure.
Brown Eyed Girl.
Oh, fair enough. Good song.
Well, how about a round of applause?
Because this group is typically doesn't ask.
That's my fault.
Thank you all for asking your questions, working hard.
It's just out of their norm. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it a lot, but it wasn't typical.
Well, what we would like everyone to do is at 11:20 rejoin your class Zoom session. We have a little something planned, but we can do it over Zoom at 11:20.
And if you have any more review questions,
Yes.
Feel free
let
to
them stew
stay.
in your head and then save them for 11:20. It's just we're resuming for regular class.
Right.
So are we using Brittany's
Yes.
Zoom, we'll use Brittany's regular class Zoom at 11:20. So did I throw you a curveball by ending early?
Yes,
Maybe.
very much so.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Yeah.
So what do you want us to say?
I was like, I can't stay another hour.
We went on break and Christian goes, I'm not gonna sit here for an hour and a half.
Yeah, it's usually ended.
Well,